Shocking line, right at the top. What if the biggest royal mystery of the decade isn't a feud, a scandal, or a political power shift, but a child? And what if that mystery hinges on a single, stunning question? Why has King Charles, one of the most photographed, most reported on men on Earth, never been publicly confirmed to have met his own granddaughter? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Strange? Absolutely. Impossible? Not at all. Because in a world where every royal handshake is analyzed, every balcony appearance becomes news, and every baby is photographed before their first sneeze, the absence of something can be louder than its presence. And that's where our story begins. But slow down for a second. Before we dive in, let me ask you directly. Have you ever noticed how the royal family, for all their pomp and pageantry, have a way of leaving just enough unanswered questions to keep the entire world talking? They don't deny. They don't confirm. They just allow the silence to breathe. And in that silence, people fill the gaps with their own theories. Some theories are wild. Some are absurd. Some feel oddly plausible. And some, like this one, stick around for years, refusing to fade. Because today's story isn't just about Charles. It isn't just about Harry or Meghan. And it certainly isn't just about little Lilibet. No, this is about the way public myth forms. The way narratives twist themselves into knots. The way a family's privacy collides with global obsession. And the way a single missing moment, a meeting that maybe happened, maybe didn't, can ignite the kind of speculation that fuels headlines, talk shows, podcasts, and internet debates for years. Now, here's where things get even stranger. The public has been given multiple stories about whether this meeting ever happened. Conflicting narratives, contradictory statements, timelines that don't line up, claims that appeared suddenly, then were never repeated, rumors that spread like wildfire without a single official correction or clarification. That should tell you something. Because when the palace stays silent, people pay attention. When the Sussexes speak, people analyze every word. And when the media can't decide which version is true, the story becomes something bigger, something more dramatic, something almost cinematic. Which brings me to another question. The one that has kept this mystery alive for years. If a royal grandchild was introduced to the monarch, wouldn't there be something? A photo, a statement, a moment, anything. But there isn't. And that doesn't prove anything. But it does raise eyebrows. Let's talk about why this matters now. The royal family has always lived on a tightrope between tradition and modernity, between secrecy and spectacle, between duty and personal pain. And lately, especially since the rift between Harry, Meghan, and the monarchy, it feels like the cable they're walking on is fraying. Every headline surrounding them becomes part of a bigger narrative about unity or division. Every absence is interpreted as a statement. Every presence is dissected as a symbol. And Lilibet, innocent in all of this, became, unintentionally, a focal point of that tension. Because when she was born, the world expected something. Not because she was royal blood, though that would be enough. Not because she was Harry and Meghan's daughter, though that alone could start a media storm. But because of her name, Lilibet, a name with weight, history, sentiment, a name that belonged only to Queen Elizabeth II, used by the closest members of her family, and never by the world. So when Harry and Meghan named their daughter after the late Queen's cherished nickname, people assumed the introduction between child and monarch, and later between child and future monarch, would be a major moment, a symbolic moment, a healing moment. But it didn't happen publicly. And whether it happened privately, well, that's where the mystery lives. Now, before the comments fill up, no, this video isn't here to claim something as fact without evidence. The goal isn't to declare what did or didn't happen behind palace walls. The goal is to explore the twists in the public narrative, the contradictions, the dramatic tension, the unanswered questions that turned an innocent child's life into one of the most debated royal topics in years. Because here's the real hook. The story of whether King Charles ever met Lilibet isn't just a story about a meeting. It's about what it represents. A family divided, a monarchy under pressure, a public desperate for clarity, a media industry addicted to mystery, and a silence, strategic or otherwise, that keeps the world guessing. So let's rewind the clock. Let's go back to where the rumors started. Not years later, Not after the Jubilee controversies or the travel confusion or the palace statements that seemed to contradict each other. No, we're going back to the moment this narrative first flickered to life, when a single detail, a single phrasing, a single unanswered question cracked open a storyline that would grow far beyond expectation. Because once the first inconsistency appeared, the rest began to pile up, and the timeline became messy. Too messy. Messy enough to give the internet everything it needed to build its own version of events. And that is exactly where our investigation truly begins. But before we dive into that, let's set the stage a little more. Think for a moment about how the royal family has handled past births and introductions. Think of George, Charlotte, and Louis, photographed outside the hospital within hours. Think of Archie, introduced in a carefully controlled setting. Think of other royal babies throughout history, displayed to the world like symbols of continuity. And then think of Lilibet, born in California, raised privately, shielded from royal photographers, existing in a world that operates almost opposite to the one her father grew up in. That difference alone changed everything. Because for the first time in modern history, a royal baby entered the world completely outside the monarchy's visibility and stayed there. And for some people, that silence bred fascination. For others, suspicion. For others still, simple curiosity. Then came the conflicting statements. The ones that seemed to hint at a meeting. The ones that others believed suggested otherwise. The ones so vaguely worded they could be interpreted in multiple ways. And that's when the questions exploded. When did the meeting happen? Did it happen at all? Why was nothing ever confirmed? Why were there no photos? Why did spokespeople stop repeating the claims? Why did the palace never comment? Why did the story shift depending on who told it? Why did the narrative depend entirely on trust rather than evidence? These questions aren't accusations, they're observations. And they are the exact questions that turned a simple family matter into a global talking point. But with all those mysteries swirling, something even more fascinating happened. Both sides of the public. Those who support the monarchy and those who support the Sussexes began using the same gaps in information to build completely opposite theories. That is the true power of ambiguity. Now, as we move forward, you will see just how tangled this timeline becomes. You will see moments where the story seems to make sense, only to unravel again. You will see statements that appear clear until compared to others. And you will see how a single detail, just one, can turn the entire narrative around. Because the story of whether King Charles ever met Lilibet isn't flat. It's layered. It's complicated. It's emotional. And yes, it's dramatic. But let me warn you now, the deeper we go, the stranger the contradictions become. And that brings us to the final part of this introduction, the doorway into Chapter 1. Because everything you think you know about this story, every assumption, every headline, every quote, all of it is about to be challenged. And what comes next? Well, what came next would change the entire narrative, and no one, absolutely no one, saw it coming. Hook. It all started with a single, offhand comment. Something that, at the time, seemed trivial, almost forgettable. But that comment would ignite a storm of speculation, rumors, and questions that continue to swirl to this day. It happened during one of those seemingly routine royal appearances, an interview, a public statement, a press briefing. A journalist asked a question, and the answer, or perhaps the phrasing of the answer, left the world with a subtle, almost imperceptible gap. "Have you met your granddaughter yet?" someone asked. The reply? Something polite, evasive, and yet strangely specific. "No," came the response. Simple, direct, but in that one word, the seed of a mystery was planted. Because context matters. In most families, a simple no might be taken at face value. But in the royal family, in the glare of global media, no is a loaded word. And when that no was recorded, shared, and repeated, it suddenly became more than an answer. It became the spark for an entire narrative that would explode across headlines, talk shows, online forums, and social media. Here's where the story begins to twist. Because almost immediately, other sources appeared. Royal commentators, journalists with insider contacts, and even unnamed palace aides started filling in the gaps, or trying to. Some suggested the meeting had happened privately, but was intentionally kept out of the public eye. Others suggested that it hadn't happened at all, that scheduling conflicts, travel issues, or personal choices had prevented it. And then there were the whispers, unverifiable claims that only made the public more curious. Think about it. If the King of England, one of the most prominent figures on the planet, has a granddaughter who is the daughter of the son he shares a very public history with, why would a meeting not happen? Why would it be avoided? And if it did happen, why isn't there evidence? Photos? Statements? Something tangible? The ambiguity alone is enough to fuel curiosity. But as we will see, it's not just ambiguity. It's contradictions, timing conflicts, and statements that don't line up with reality. These small cracks are what the media and the public have pounced on for years. And then came the first timeline discrepancies. People began cross-referencing public appearances, flight logs, and media statements to try to piece together a coherent story. But instead of clarity, they found gaps, missing information, moments that didn't align. Some of these inconsistencies were minor, just a few days off. Others were more significant, raising real questions about what actually happened behind palace walls. One example that stands out involves an official engagement the king had planned around the same time as a public celebration for the Sussexes. Observers noticed that, according to publicly available information, Charles was supposed to be in one location while Lilibet was reportedly in another. The logistical impossibility seemed to confirm one theory, that no meeting had occurred. Yet, other sources hinted that a private introduction had been arranged discreetly, in a setting removed from public attention. The media frenzy that followed was predictable. Every outlet, every pundit, every social media influencer began speculating. Headlines varied wildly, from King Charles meets granddaughter in private to royal rift prevents grandfather from meeting granddaughter. And for the average viewer, the story became confusing, emotional, and impossible to ignore. But the key turning point in the rumor mill happened when public attention reached a fever pitch. Photos, or the absence of them, were analyzed frame by frame. Commentators dissected body language, seating arrangements, and subtle references during interviews. Everything, no matter how minor, was scrutinized, and every ambiguity was transformed into potential evidence for or against the theory that Charles had met Lilibet. What makes this chapter particularly fascinating is how quickly speculation took on a life of its own. In a matter of weeks, the rumor was no longer just about a potential meeting. It became a question of legitimacy, protocol, family dynamics, and even loyalty. Was this a calculated decision by the palace? A result of miscommunication? Or simply a natural outcome of an increasingly complex family structure? As the story unfolded, the narrative was punctuated with emotional spikes. Supporters of the Sussexes highlighted the possibility of emotional neglect or distance, portraying a loving daughter and son-in-law struggling to introduce their child into a rigid, sometimes cold institution. Supporters of the monarchy, meanwhile, emphasized tradition and protocol, suggesting that privacy, timing, and discretion always took precedence over public spectacle. Audience engagement soared. People were captivated not just by the story itself, but by the human elements embedded in it. The idea that a child could become the center of such attention, debate, and emotional investment highlighted the extraordinary nature of the royal family in the modern world. And yet, despite the drama, nothing was confirmed. No evidence. No verified photos. No statements that resolved the ambiguity. Just questions. And those questions multiplied with every passing day. Now, here's the part that really hooked people. Even minor, seemingly innocuous details became evidence, or fodder, for speculation. A canceled appearance, a travel plan, a cryptic social media post, all were interpreted as signs. And in the absence of clarity, the public filled in the blanks. Imagine being in the shoes of someone trying to piece together this puzzle. Every headline is a potential clue. Every interview is a potential confession. Every silence is a potential admission. And the more you try to resolve the mystery, the deeper you go, the more contradictions you encounter. The result? The rumor evolves into a narrative, and the narrative becomes something larger than life. A story about family, tradition, and the intense scrutiny that comes with royalty. By the end of this chapter, the audience is left wondering, what was the initial no really about? Was it a factual statement, or carefully worded to preserve privacy? Was it an honest answer, or part of a carefully constructed narrative? And most importantly, what came next? And how would that change everything? Because this was only the beginning. The moment the rumor began, it triggered a chain reaction that no one, not even the palace insiders, could fully control. And as we move into the next chapter, we'll explore the first scheduled meeting that was supposed to happen, but didn't. And that missed moment, that gap between expectation and reality, is where the story truly starts to twist. Cliffhanger. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Hook. Everyone expected this to be the moment. The big reveal. The photograph that would settle years of speculation. A grandfather meeting his granddaughter for the first time. A moment as symbolic as it was emotional. Yet, when the day came, something strange happened. It didn't happen. Imagine the scene. The anticipation was electric. Royal insiders were discreetly informed. Journalists were on standby, ready to capture history. Social media was already buzzing with speculation. Will we finally see Charles with Lilibet? People asked. Will this be the moment of reconciliation? The public wanted it. The media wanted it. Even casual observers around the world sensed this was not just a family meeting. It was a story that would define the monarchy for a generation. And then nothing. Nothing appeared publicly. No press release. No photograph. No statement. Just silence. To understand the impact, you have to understand the context. The first months of Lilibet's life were carefully managed. Harry and Meghan were clear about protecting their child's privacy. The palace had its own protocols, traditions, and expectations. In theory, the meeting should have been straightforward. Yet, the practical and emotional complications created a scenario where even simple logistics became monumental. Timing, travel arrangements, overlapping engagements, and even the smallest miscommunication could, and did, interfere. One report suggests that the king's calendar was packed with official events, meetings, and visits, leaving very little room for spontaneous family encounters. Another claims that Meghan and Harry's travel plans were already set, with Lilibet's schedule prioritizing privacy over public exposure. Combine these factors, and what seems simple to an outsider suddenly becomes a highly complicated affair. But here's where the intrigue deepens. Some sources indicated that the meeting did happen, briefly, privately, and away from the cameras. Others said the meeting had been planned but postponed indefinitely. Conflicting accounts emerged, each carrying enough credibility to keep public interest alive. The result? A growing divide between speculation and verified fact. Now, let's pause and consider the emotional stakes. For a grandfather, the first encounter with a granddaughter is a personal, intimate moment. But in this case, it wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. For decades, the monarchy has relied on images and appearances to convey unity, strength, and continuity. A public introduction of Lilibet to her grandfather would have been a perfect image of family harmony. Its absence, however, fueled rumors and emotional tension. The media narrative quickly seized on this absence. Headlines shifted from royal family prepares for private meeting to royal rift prevents grandfather from seeing granddaughter. Online discussions exploded. Speculation about the palace's intentions, the Sussexes' priorities, and even the emotional distance between family members became the dominant story. One particularly controversial moment involved reports of a planned garden visit that was supposedly canceled at the last minute. The reasoning was unclear. Some suggested logistical conflicts, others cited health and safety concerns, and still others hinted at more complex family dynamics. The lack of transparency created a vacuum, one that the public, naturally, tried to fill. And then came the questions about evidence. Surely, someone in the royal press office would leak a photograph. Surely, a statement would clarify the ambiguity. Surely, someone would provide context to put speculation to rest. Yet nothing concrete appeared. The absence of evidence became, in itself, a topic of fascination. Imagine the public reaction at this point. People were analyzing everything. The royal calendar, flight logs, prior appearances, interviews. Every detail, no matter how minor, was dissected. A glance from Charles during a televised appearance, a comment from Harry during a podcast, even Meghan's casual remarks during interviews, all became potential clues. And yet, each clue seemed to contradict the others. At this stage, the mystery was no longer just about a missed meeting. It became about the human and institutional elements behind it. Tradition versus privacy, duty versus emotion, public image versus personal connection. Observers began to wonder whether this was simply a case of logistics gone wrong, or whether deeper tensions were at play, tensions that could affect the monarchy's image for years to come. But perhaps the most fascinating element was how quickly speculation turned into narrative. Outlets across the globe began crafting stories that assumed intention, that the meeting didn't happen because of a rift, because of protocol, or because of calculated strategy. Each interpretation added layers of drama, feeding the very mystery it purported to explain. And then came the unexpected twist. Even though no public meeting occurred, subtle indicators suggested that private communications may have been ongoing. Phone calls, video messages, and private exchanges were hinted at by various sources. If true, these interactions, hidden from public view, added another layer to the puzzle. Was a meeting truly missed, or was it replaced with a less visible but equally meaningful alternative? The public could only guess. The emotional impact on everyone involved cannot be overstated. For Charles, the pressures of being both a monarch and a grandfather intersected in a moment of unprecedented scrutiny. For Harry and Meghan, the challenges of parenting under the constant eye of the world amplified the tension. And for Lilibet, an innocent child, these dynamics created an unavoidable intrigue surrounding her earliest months, a narrative that she had no control over but would inevitably be shaped by. As the day of the expected meeting came and went, the story began to take on a life of its own. Discussions online, in print, and on television blurred the line between speculation and fact. The narrative became cyclical. Every rumor sparked questions. Every question led to more rumors, and every rumor created emotional spikes that kept the audience engaged and invested. And yet, despite all the drama, nothing was officially confirmed. The meeting's absence lingered like a shadow, a gap that invited analysis, debate, and endless curiosity. The public was left in suspense, hungry for the next piece of evidence, or at least a hint that clarity might be forthcoming. The stage was set, the anticipation was high, and the implications were enormous. A simple meeting, or the lack thereof, had transformed into a symbolic moment representing family dynamics, public perception, and the intersection of personal and institutional life. Cliffhanger, but the story doesn't end there. Because the next chapter reveals how royal protocol, tradition, and unprecedented circumstances collided, creating complications that no one could have anticipated. And what came next? It changed the trajectory of the narrative entirely, and the world was left watching, waiting, and questioning what was really happening behind palace walls. Protocol has been blamed for nearly everything in the royal family. How they walk, how they speak, even how they eat. But in the case of Lilibet's introduction, protocol was more than tradition. It became a tangled web that dictated who could meet whom, when, and under what circumstances. And in this story, one exception would change everything. To understand why the first meeting didn't happen as expected, we have to go back to the basics of royal protocol. The monarchy operates on a set of rules that are centuries old. Every action, every event, every public interaction is guided by precedent. There are expectations for the youngest members of the family, for the line of succession, and for the public image of the monarchy itself. In many ways, it is a machine designed to maintain stability, predictability, and control. For most royal children, the process is simple. Photographs at the hospital, public appearances alongside parents, introductions to grandparents that are carefully timed and choreographed. The rules exist for clarity and consistency, so that the monarchy's image is maintained and public perception remains stable. But then came Harry and Meghan, a couple who, intentionally or not, forced the institution to bend, adapt, and, in some ways, break its rules. From the moment they stepped back from official duties, they created a unique exception. They were still royals, yes, but their roles had fundamentally changed. And this change disrupted the usual flow of protocol. Consider this. If Harry had remained a fully active working royal, the process of introducing Lilibet to her grandfather would have been almost automatic. There would have been no question, no ambiguity. But because Harry and Meghan had stepped back, the monarchy had to consider new factors. Should the king meet Lilibet privately, or publicly? Should the meeting be formal or casual? How much should be disclosed to the press? And most importantly, how would the optics play out in a world obsessed with both family unity and royal drama? Every decision was a balancing act. On one side, the desire to protect the child's privacy, particularly in an era of intense media scrutiny. On the other, the expectations of tradition, duty, and public interest. And then there were the additional considerations of emotional tension, timing conflicts, and the possibility of misunderstandings. Some insiders suggested that the palace initially attempted to follow a conventional approach, a private introduction in a controlled setting, with no press allowed. But the Sussexes, valuing privacy above all, reportedly preferred a more flexible arrangement, or perhaps even deferred entirely until a time that suited their family. The result? A clash of priorities that made the meeting difficult to schedule and, for the public, nearly impossible to confirm. And this is where the concept of the Sussex exception takes center stage. Unlike other royal children, Lilibet's introduction was not dictated purely by protocol. The parents' wishes overrode, modified, or at least complicated the usual rules. That one deviation, choosing privacy over tradition, created ripples across the narrative. Suddenly, a simple family gathering became a point of intrigue, speculation, and even controversy. Now, let's examine why this matters. Royal protocol is more than ceremony. It communicates hierarchy, unity, and public trust. Every missed step, every deviation, sends signals, sometimes unintentionally. By following or breaking protocol, royals influence perception. They send messages about relationships, priorities, and loyalty. And in the case of Lilibet, the choice to follow or not follow. The rules became a silent but powerful statement. This also created a domino effect. Journalists, commentators, and royal watchers began analyzing every possible angle. Timing of visits, social media hints, travel schedules, even offhand comments. Every observation was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Every absence was interpreted as an intentional statement. Every potential interaction became a clue, a piece of a puzzle that no one could definitively solve. And here's an intriguing wrinkle. Protocol is rarely black and white. It exists in a gray area of precedent, tradition, and personal discretion. In some cases, exceptions have been made for decades-old reasons. In others, deviation sparks scandal or criticism. The Sussexes' situation was unique because it combined modern priorities, privacy, autonomy, global attention, with centuries-old expectations of public duty and family hierarchy. This tension explains why confusion reigned. If you follow the traditional path, the story is simple. Baby is born, grandfather meets grandchild, public witnesses the event. But when new variables enter the mix, step back from royal duties, intense media scrutiny, desire for privacy, the story becomes layered, unpredictable, and rife with contradictions. Emotional stakes also played a role. Think about the human element. A grandfather eager to meet his granddaughter, parents concerned about security and media intrusion, a monarchy wanting to preserve its image. Each party had motivations that could clash. Even well-intentioned actions risked misinterpretation. A delayed visit could look like neglect. A private meeting could be seen as secrecy. A public appearance could violate the family's trust. All these pressures compounded, creating a perfect storm for rumors and speculation. What should have been a joyful, straightforward moment became a subject of global fascination. And every misstep, or perceived misstep, was amplified through media channels, online commentary, and public imagination. The story doesn't end with the missed meeting itself. The Sussex exception, this unique deviation from protocol, set the stage for a series of events, statements, and appearances that would fuel speculation for years. Each subsequent interaction, or lack thereof, was colored by this initial deviation. Every headline became a reflection of what was expected versus what actually occurred. Let's set the stage. When Archie was born, the Sussexes carefully orchestrated his public introduction. Photographs were released, showing the proud parents with their newborn son. The images became iconic, widely circulated, and immediately cemented a public narrative. This is the new generation of royals, blending tradition with modernity. Fast forward to Lilibet. The expectations were similar. Fans, media outlets, and royal watchers anticipated an official introduction to King Charles, likely accompanied by photos. But instead of images, there was silence. No official photographs. No palace-sanctioned release. No public documentation of the moment that many believed had occurred or was about to occur. And here's where the intrigue deepens. The absence of photos was interpreted in multiple, conflicting ways. One school of thought suggested the lack of images indicated the meeting never happened. After all, if the king had indeed met his granddaughter, why wouldn't the palace release a photograph? On the other hand, others argued that the privacy-focused Sussexes had requested discretion and that the meeting was intentionally kept behind closed doors. The absence of evidence became fertile ground for speculation. Media analysts, accustomed to deciphering royal imagery for hidden meaning, began combing for subtle hints. A glance in a televised appearance. A side comment in an interview. Any vague reference that could imply a meeting occurred was dissected in detail. Every micro-expression, every slight change in tone, became a potential clue. This intense scrutiny magnified the significance of missing photographs. Where once an image would have confirmed a story, its absence created suspense. Where once silence might have been ignored, now it was treated as intentional messaging. The vacuum left by missing photographs allowed for multiple competing narratives to flourish, each feeding curiosity and debate. Now, consider the psychological effect on the public. Humans are visual creatures. We rely on images to authenticate reality. A photograph is more than a picture. It's proof, it's confirmation, it's trust. Without it, doubt creeps in. And when doubt exists in the context of royalty, already shrouded in tradition, secrecy, and media spectacle, it becomes a catalyst for myth-making. But there's more. Some insiders hinted at potential private photographs, images that were captured but not released, perhaps taken during a discreet visit, a small family gathering, or even a casual interaction. The existence of such images, unverified and inaccessible, added another layer of mystery. Were they intentionally withheld to protect privacy? Or was there a strategic reason to maintain ambiguity in public perception? The lack of clarity fueled debate. Contrast this with previous royal births and introductions. The public has grown accustomed to transparency in moments deemed symbolically important. George, Charlotte, Louis, and even Archie had their photographs shared. These images communicated family unity, continuity, and tradition. The absence of similar documentation for Lilibet broke the pattern, and people noticed. The media quickly picked up on this inconsistency. Royal commentators, tabloids, and social media influencers speculated endlessly. Has the meeting occurred but been concealed? They asked. Is there tension behind the scenes? Some reports even suggested that the missing photographs were indicative of a broader estrangement or disconnect between the generations. Others argued that it was merely a reflection of the Sussexes' desire for privacy, a modern approach clashing with centuries-old expectations. Emotional stakes also played a role. For supporters of the monarchy, the absence of photographs symbolized distance or even rejection. For supporters of Harry and Meghan, it represented careful parenting, the need to protect a child from relentless public scrutiny, and the right to control one's own family narrative. For neutral observers, it was simply confusing. The lack of visual proof created a suspenseful vacuum that the imagination filled, often with dramatic interpretations. And here's where the story twists even further. Social media amplified every minor detail. A comment from a family member, a fleeting mention in an interview, or an ambiguous post could become evidence of a meeting or its absence. People were connecting dots that might not even be related. The public, desperate for confirmation, constructed its own version of events in real time. Then came speculation about future appearances. Some suggested that photographs might be released at a later date, perhaps to coincide with a public event, a holiday, or a ceremonial occasion. Others questioned whether such a release would ever happen, suggesting that the lack of imagery had become an intentional strategy, a way to maintain suspense, public attention, and narrative control. All of this demonstrates a key point. The absence of photographs was never just about images. It was about perception, symbolism, and narrative. The missing photographs became a story unto themselves, a story about family, privacy, and the complex interplay between modern media expectations and royal tradition. The tension continued to build as the public and media alike waited for clarity that never arrived. And in that vacuum, speculation reached its peak. People began interpreting silence as confirmation of estrangement, secrecy, or even emotional distance. Every potential meeting was scrutinized, every statement overanalyzed, and every ambiguity magnified. Let's start with Harry's side of the story. Since stepping back from royal duties, Harry has been unusually candid for a figure so historically private. He's given interviews, participated in podcasts, written memoirs, and spoken at events, all with remarkable transparency. And in each, references to family dynamics, emotional distance, and the challenges of maintaining connections with the royal family have emerged. When Harry discussed Lilibet, he was careful, often cryptic, but the implications were clear. There was complexity, nuance, and, at times, distance. Even without directly saying whether Charles had met his daughter, Harry's phrasing left room for interpretation. Some listeners inferred that meetings had occurred privately. Others inferred that no meetings had taken place. Ambiguity became a powerful storytelling device. Contrast this with the palace. The royal institution, as always, adhered to its long-standing policy. Official statements were rare, deliberate, and carefully constructed. Silence, in the monarchy, is not an oversight. It's a tool. It shapes public perception, maintains dignity, and controls narratives without overt confrontation. But in the case of Lilibet, silence had an unintended effect. It amplified curiosity. Every question left unanswered became a rumor. Every absence of clarification became a story. Consider the impact of this dynamic. When one party speaks and the other remains silent, the human mind naturally seeks resolution. People begin to connect dots, fill in gaps, and imagine narratives that may or may not be true. Suddenly, every offhand comment, every partial disclosure, every evasive answer becomes a piece of a larger puzzle. And in this puzzle, Harry's hints were interpreted as clues or confessions about family interactions that no one outside the inner circle could confirm. Now, add to this the timing of events. Public statements by Harry often coincided with major royal occasions, anniversaries, holidays, or ceremonial events. To the public, it seemed as if his commentary was strategically timed to highlight contrasts, or perhaps to exert subtle pressure. The palace's silence during these moments created a stark juxtaposition. One voice spoke directly to the world, the other maintained tradition, discretion, and careful distance. This tension fueled emotional reactions. Supporters of Harry and Meghan framed his openness as bravery, honesty, and a commitment to transparency. Critics suggested that his commentary was strategic, divisive, or even provocative. For the neutral observer, it was mesmerizing. Like watching a complex chess match where every move, every word, and every pause had significance. One particularly striking moment occurred during an interview in which Harry discussed the challenges of raising his children under intense scrutiny. He spoke about protecting them from unwanted attention, controlling their narrative, and ensuring that their first years were as normal as possible. Listeners immediately connected these remarks to the question of Lilibet's introduction. Was Harry implying that privacy had prevented a meeting? Or was he simply emphasizing the family's right to choose how and when to interact? The ambiguity was intoxicating. Meanwhile, the palace's silence created fertile ground for speculation. Journalists analyzed every press briefing, every official statement, every absence of comment. They asked questions repeatedly, sometimes directly to palace representatives. The answers, invariably limited or non-existent, became as significant as any confirmation. Observers began to interpret silence as evidence, sometimes of intentional omission, sometimes of procedural necessity, sometimes of tension behind the scenes. And here's a fascinating psychological twist. People are naturally drawn to gaps in knowledge. When information is missing, the imagination fills in the blanks. The more high-profile the figures involved, the more intense the speculation. Harry's candid remarks juxtaposed with the palace's silence created exactly this effect, a vacuum where the public's curiosity became the story itself. As the months passed, this dynamic played out repeatedly. Harry would speak in one forum, subtly allude to family matters, and the palace would respond with silence. Social media, talk shows, and news outlets exploded with analysis, theories, and debates. Every listener became an investigator. Every viewer became a detective. Every ambiguous phrase was dissected for hidden meaning. Yet, the contradiction remained unresolved. Harry's openness suggested something, but the lack of official confirmation left the narrative dangling. Was the king avoiding meetings? Was the silence intentional? Or was it simply an effort to maintain discretion and privacy? The public had no definitive answers, only questions, theories, and speculation. Emotional tension peaked as the story evolved. Supporters of the Sussexes felt validated by Harry's statements, interpreting them as confirmation of distance, misunderstanding, or even estrangement. Supporters of the monarchy read his remarks differently, viewing them as strategic storytelling that distorted reality. And for everyone else, the story was both riveting and frustrating, a narrative built as much on what wasn't said as what was. This chapter also illustrates a fundamental truth about communication in high-stakes situations. Sometimes, what you don't say is just as powerful as what you do. In this case, Harry's words created transparency, while the palace's silence created authority. The collision of these two forces produced drama, suspense, and intrigue on a global scale. And as we move into the next chapter, we'll see how a specific public event, the Jubilee, further complicated the narrative. It was a moment meant to unify, meant to celebrate tradition and continuity, but instead it amplified contradictions, fueled rumors, and deepened the mystery of whether Lilibet had been introduced to her grandfather. Let's set the scene. The Jubilee was meticulously planned, featuring parades, balcony appearances, and countless ceremonial events. Every detail was orchestrated to project harmony, continuity, and a sense of national pride. The media spotlight was intense, as it always is during royal milestones, and global audiences tuned in to witness the family united in celebration. And yet, amid the pomp and pageantry, questions arose. Where was Lilibet? Was she present? Had she been introduced to her grandfather? Observers noted that, while other royal children were visible, Lilibet's presence was conspicuously absent. Cameras captured smiling parents, attentive crowds, and generations of royals, yet the Sussex family remained distant, partially in the background, and notably private. Here is where the controversy begins. This absence sparked endless speculation. Supporters of Harry and Meghan suggested it was a deliberate choice, a protective measure for the children in an environment dominated by cameras, crowds, and global attention. Critics read it differently, suggesting it was symbolic. A subtle rebuke, an intentional distancing from the monarchy, and the ambiguity was magnified by the careful choreography of the event. Consider the implications. Jubilees are not casual affairs. They are highly symbolic, steeped in centuries of tradition. Every appearance, every seating arrangement, every wave from a balcony carries meaning. For Lilibet to be absent, or invisible, was more than a practical choice. It became a public statement, whether intentional or not. And in a world obsessed with symbolism, the story quickly took on layers beyond the factual. The media response was immediate. Analysts dissected live broadcasts, scrutinized photographs, and highlighted subtle cues. Notice how the Sussexes were positioned, one commentator asked. Notice the lack of interaction between Charles and Harry? Another piece speculated about private introductions that may have occurred off-camera. Every observation was amplified and debated. But the Jubilee didn't just generate speculation about presence or absence. It also exposed contradictions in statements made by both Harry and palace representatives. Public remarks about the Sussex family's participation varied from platform to platform, leaving audiences confused. Some statements implied reconciliation, while others emphasized ongoing tension or careful boundaries. Once again, silence became a tool, but one that fueled curiosity rather than quelling it. This controversy also highlighted the delicate balance between tradition and modernity. The monarchy operates on centuries of precedent, the expectation of family unity, public appearances, and ceremonial hierarchy. Yet the Sussexes' choices represented a modern approach, prioritizing privacy, autonomy, and personal agency. The collision of these philosophies created the perfect storm for misunderstanding and speculation. And let's not forget the emotional stakes. For Charles, the Jubilee was meant to be a moment of celebration with family, an affirmation of legacy, connection, and continuity. The absence or limited visibility of his granddaughter, Lilibet, added an emotional layer that observers could sense, even from afar. For Harry and Meghan, the priority was protecting their children and maintaining control over their narrative, a decision that, while understandable, carried implications for public perception. The Jubilee also sparked social media frenzy. Every minor detail became a talking point. A glance, a wave, a subtle gesture interpreted as affectionate or distant. Meme culture, live reactions, and viral posts amplified the tension, turning what might have been a quiet family choice into a global debate. And here's the most intriguing aspect. During the Jubilee, one fleeting interaction caught the attention of royal watchers. A brief exchange, almost imperceptible, between Charles and Harry was captured on camera. Some interpreted it as warmth and reconciliation. Others argued it was formal, strained, and rehearsed. The ambiguity was maddening, and intentional or not, it became a defining moment in the narrative surrounding Lilibet's introduction. The key takeaway is this: the Jubilee didn't provide clarity, it multiplied questions. The absence, the silences, the fleeting gestures, and the contradictory interpretations created a perfect storm of speculation. For the public, it was simultaneously fascinating, confusing, and emotionally charged. And the implications extended beyond the ceremony itself. Analysts began revisiting prior statements, timelines, and media coverage, seeking connections that might explain the ambiguity. Each new theory fueled additional discussion, and the story of whether King Charles had met Lilibet or might meet her in the future remained unresolved, shrouded in mystery. Let's begin with the nature of leaks. In the royal sphere, information rarely comes directly from the family. Instead, it travels through intermediaries, aides, staff, journalists, or acquaintances. Some leaks are intentional, crafted to guide public perception. Others are accidental, born from casual conversation or misinterpreted statements. And in the case of the Sussexes and King Charles, the leaks were both subtle and explosive. One of the first significant leaks emerged shortly after Lilibet's birth. A reporter, citing unnamed sources, claimed that Charles had not yet met his granddaughter in a formal setting. The phrasing was careful, technically true, technically vague, but it set off a wave of speculation. Every word was analyzed. Did formal setting imply that a private meeting had occurred? Was it a diplomatic way of saying that no meeting had ever taken place? The ambiguity was intoxicating for the media and public alike. Then came the offhand remarks in interviews. Harry, in particular, spoke about his family and the challenges of balancing privacy with public expectation. One line, seemingly casual, was dissected endlessly. We're raising our children in a way that protects them from unnecessary attention. On the surface, it was a statement about parenting. But analysts interpreted it as a subtle confirmation that Lilibet had not been introduced to her grandfather, or that any such introduction was carefully controlled and shielded from the public eye. Contradictions soon appeared as well. While Harry hinted at privacy and distance, other statements suggested warmth and connection. Reports surfaced claiming Charles had visited the Sussexes privately, but no evidence. No photographs, no official statements corroborated the claim. The resulting tension between statements and silence created fertile ground for speculation. Here's where the intrigue deepens. The leaks were often inconsistent. Some suggested that the king had made efforts to meet Lilibet, while others implied that scheduling conflicts or emotional tension had prevented it. In the absence of concrete evidence, each story was accepted as plausible, feeding a growing narrative that alternately portrayed unity and estrangement. Social media amplified every contradiction. Fans, commentators, and conspiracy theorists dissected each phrase, cross-referenced it with other events, and created timelines that attempted to make sense of the conflicting information. A casual remark from a journalist could be interpreted as a major revelation. An offhand comment from a family member could ignite a week of debate. Every ambiguity became a story in itself. The psychological effect of this is significant. Humans crave closure, especially in emotionally charged narratives. When faced with contradictions and gaps, the mind seeks to resolve them, even if resolution means creating theories or accepting partial truths. The Sussex narrative, punctuated by leaks and offhand remarks, was perfectly suited to this pattern. But there was more at play than just human curiosity. The strategic element cannot be ignored. Some analysts suggested that leaks were intentionally crafted to maintain public interest, manage expectations, and control the narrative. By allowing ambiguity to persist, both the palace and the Sussexes kept the story alive, ensuring global attention while minimizing direct confrontation. And then came another twist: conflicting media coverage. Some outlets framed the leaks as evidence of estrangement. Others presented them as signs of a carefully orchestrated strategy to protect the child's privacy. The result was an information environment where truth, rumor, and interpretation collided, creating a narrative as complex and dramatic as any fictional tale. Emotional stakes continued to rise. Supporters of Harry and Meghan interpreted leaks as evidence of care, discretion, and modern parenting. Supporters of the monarchy read the same leaks as signs of division, tension, or even disrespect toward tradition. And for neutral observers, the contradictions created suspense, curiosity, and, ultimately, engagement, the kind of engagement that keeps a story alive for years. As the narrative evolved, it became clear that no single statement could resolve the question of Lilibet's introduction. Every revelation, every hint, every contradiction added layers of complexity. And yet, in that complexity lay the drama. The world was captivated, emotionally invested, and endlessly speculating. Sometimes, the smallest gestures speak louder than words. A glance, a pause, a fleeting expression can convey more than hours of interviews. And during one public appearance, such a gesture sent shockwaves through the media and left the world questioning the state of the royal family and Lilibet's place within it. The scene was carefully orchestrated. A ceremonial event, attended by multiple generations of the royal family, provided the perfect opportunity for observation. Cameras were rolling, photographers were positioned strategically, and every movement was analyzed for signs of protocol, warmth, or discord. And then it happened, a moment lasting only seconds, but captured in hundreds of photographs and countless video frames. Observers noticed a subtle hesitation, a brief lack of eye contact, or a measured distance between family members. For some, it was inconsequential. For others, it was a glaring signal that relationships were strained, or at least complicated. Here's why this moment was so impactful. In royal appearances, gestures are meticulously choreographed. Every wave, nod, and handshake is designed to communicate unity, decorum, and connection. Any deviation from that choreography, however small, is immediately noticed and interpreted. When the world is watching, even a second of perceived tension becomes headline news. Social media exploded. Analysts dissected the images frame by frame, speculating on the meaning behind every expression and movement. "Look at the way he avoids looking at Harry," one commentator claimed. "Notice the subtle distance in posture," tweeted another. Every detail, every nuance became evidence, real or imagined, about family dynamics and Lilibet's introduction. And the intrigue was amplified by context. The event occurred months after Lilibet's birth, long enough for the world to expect a public acknowledgement, a visual confirmation of connection. The absence of clear interaction between Charles and the Sussex family sparked speculation. Had a private meeting occurred? Was the family deliberately maintaining distance? Or was it simply a result of ceremony, timing, and logistics? Psychologically, this moment tapped into something universal. People read meaning into small signals, especially in emotionally charged or high-stakes situations. A pause, a glance, or even a smile, or lack thereof, can be interpreted as approval, disapproval, warmth, or tension. And in this case, the public eagerly filled in the blanks. Then came the media narratives. Outlets around the world quickly framed the moment as evidence of tension. Analysts cited prior statements, interviews, and leaked information to support their interpretations. Headlines ranged from royal rift exposed in public gesture to subtle signals hint at distance between king and granddaughter. The story grew, fueled by speculation, contradictions, and the emotional weight of the moment. Yet, the reality was likely more nuanced. Protocol, timing, and ceremonial obligations all play a role in how family members interact during public events. A gesture that appears tense in one frame may simply be the result of positioning, cameras, or the flow of the event. But nuance is rarely the dominant narrative in media coverage, especially when it comes to royals. Dramatic interpretation captures attention, drives engagement, and fuels curiosity. This moment also underscores a recurring theme: ambiguity fuels fascination. The combination of gestures, timing, and prior context created an environment where every observer could project their interpretation. Some saw reconciliation, others saw estrangement. Some saw protection of privacy, others saw avoidance. And the truth, obscured by the optics and silence, remained tantalizingly out of reach. Emotionally, the moment resonated because it represented stakes beyond protocol. It was about family, connection, and the intersection of personal relationships with public expectation. The world was witnessing not just a ceremonial event, but a microcosm of the challenges inherent in balancing modern parenting, personal privacy, and centuries-old tradition. And the impact didn't stop there. In the days following the event, pundits, journalists, and social media users analyzed the footage repeatedly. The subtle signals became symbolic, fueling further speculation about Lilibet's introduction or absence thereof, and the dynamics between Charles, Harry, and Meghan. The narrative continued to twist, evolve, and grow in complexity. Dates matter. In a story built on secrecy, silence, and speculation, timelines become evidence, and every calendar entry is scrutinized. For Lilibet's introduction, or the lack thereof, the timeline itself became a source of confusion, contradiction, and intrigue. It all began when journalists and royal watchers attempted to reconstruct events surrounding the first months of Lilibet's life. Birth announcements, media appearances, travel schedules, and prior commitments were all mapped meticulously. At first glance, the sequence appeared straightforward. But as analysts dug deeper, discrepancies emerged. Consider the conflicting reports. One source claimed that King Charles had been scheduled to visit the Sussexes in early June. Another suggested that Meghan and Harry had private plans that overlapped, making the meeting impossible. Yet another insider hinted that the king had made an impromptu visit, without confirmation, photographs, or public acknowledgement. Each account carried just enough credibility to create ambiguity. The result was a tangled web of dates, events, and statements. Observers attempted to reconcile these inconsistencies, but the more they tried, the more contradictions appeared. A canceled appearance here, a rescheduled meeting there, and suddenly the narrative had multiple, competing versions of the same story. This confusion was compounded by the fact that both sides, the Sussexes and the palace, were largely silent. Silence, in this context, was not neutral. It allowed speculation to flourish. Every missing or contradictory entry on the timeline became a potential clue. Every gap was interpreted as proof of estrangement, secrecy, or intentional avoidance. One particularly puzzling aspect involved travel schedules. The Sussexes had multiple publicized trips during Lilibet's first months, while the king's calendar was filled with official engagements. Analysts tried to cross-reference these dates, looking for overlaps or opportunities for a private meeting. Yet even with meticulous examination, certainty remained elusive. Either a meeting had occurred in secret, or it had been delayed indefinitely. The ambiguity persisted. Media outlets seized on this confusion. Headlines alternated between "Grandfather finally meets granddaughter" and "Royal rift prevents first meeting." Social media amplified each version, while speculation spiraled further. Timeline contradictions became a storytelling tool, a way to engage audiences and keep curiosity alive. And then came the inconsistencies in public statements. Comments made in interviews, podcasts, and public addresses often contradicted reported timelines. A statement implying a meeting had taken place clashed with a lack of photographic evidence. A remark suggesting distance conflicted with reports of private conversations. Each contradiction fed the narrative, ensuring that the story remained compelling and unresolved. Emotionally, the timeline confusion resonated with the public. People crave clarity and closure. When chronology is inconsistent, the mind naturally attempts to resolve the contradictions. In the case of Lilibet, the lack of a clear timeline fueled curiosity, speculation, and debate. Every inconsistency became a piece of a puzzle that may never be fully solved. The timeline confusion also highlighted the complexity of modern royal life. The intersection of public duty, personal privacy, media scrutiny, and logistical challenges created a scenario where a simple family introduction became nearly impossible to verify. What should have been a clear, celebrated event instead became a source of intrigue and uncertainty. And here's where the story takes another twist. Some leaks suggested that a planned introduction had been intentionally delayed, not due to logistics, but due to deeper family dynamics. This possibility added emotional weight, implying that decisions about Lilibet's introduction were influenced not only by protocol, but by relationships, trust, and potential tension. For the public, these developments created endless questions. Had Charles truly met his granddaughter? Was the meeting intentionally postponed? Were private interactions occurring that the public would never see? Every day, without clarity, intensified fascination, and every contradiction ensured that attention remained focused on the story.